Hello, and welcome to Russia Decoded, a podcast of the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C. We are recording tonight at Eastern Standard Time, Monday, December 8th, around 8:30. Just so you know, we hope that this will be released tomorrow. My name is Andy Kuchins. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest and a professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And I am sort of here virtually with my partner and collaborator, Chris Monday. Chris is in Busan, South Korea. He's a professor of economics at Dongso University there. Hi, Chris. Good morning. How are things in South Korea?
Great and sunny. So glad to be here. We really have a unique agenda-free podcast. The mainstream, they're mainly cheerleaders for a Washington agenda. Some Michael McFaul said this is a fight between good and evil. And Jake Sullivan, Biden's advisor, said, we need to look to Rocky IV for how to look at Russia. So this is an objective analysis. Where other podcasts, less mainstream, they sometimes just parrot the Kremlin line, that Ukraine any day now is finished and we just have to agree with Putin. So that's not what we do here. We have a document-based objective analysis of the news, and what we're trying to do is get under the hood and really look at what are the narratives that Russians tell themselves.
Yeah, and we use the vehicle of Russian news broadcasts, and in particular, their weekly kind of news of the week, Vesti Nedeli show, moderated by or curated by Dmitry Kiselev,
He's the
a master of the dark arts of designing and articulating a narrative. And we think it's a very useful window into how the Kremlin is thinking about themselves and how they want to portray their narrative to their people and to the rest of the world, for that matter. I mean, I've been watching the catchy music on the intro. That was from the Soviet news show Vremya, Time, circa about 1986. I started watching Soviet news back in 1981 when I was a language student in Moscow. And I knew I'd found the right partner for this when Chris told me that he had been watching Russian news every day for nearly 30 years. So this is it's a big week. As Kiselyov opened the show, he said this is a week of high intensiveness with Russia at the center of global politics. I think that actually has the virtue of being true, and Russia loves to be at the center of global politics. And the first big news story of the week was Vladimir Putin's 2-day trip to India on December 4th and 5th last week, a very carefully orchestrated visit for both sides with multiple target audiences inside Russia and India, of course, the United States and the broader West, China, and the global South, an important audience for Russia. For Russia, the message is we are not isolated. And for India, I think it is basically do not take us for granted. We are a sovereign and independent great power that does not take orders from Washington or anywhere. Now, the theater of when Mr. Modi met Putin at the airport, where he literally gave Putin a red carpet welcome at the airport. It's kind of unusual for Modi to do that with world leaders. And it really echoed Donald Trump's recent welcome of Putin in Anchorage, except that they embraced when they first met. And in fact, it was Modi that really leaned into Putin. Putin looked kind of slightly surprised at the warmth of the embrace. After that, they walked by the ritual traditional dancing women in colorful garb, and then stepped into kind of a modest white Toyota 4Runner. Looking modest for the Indian audience? Is this a display that Mr. Modi feels quite secure in Delhi and doesn't need a super Hummer armored car type vehicle? I don't know, but it was striking. Putin was, when he was getting to events, he was traveling around in his mammoth Urus. At any rate, the Russians were very impressed, actually, with the size and the grandeur of the Indian presidential palace. But they mentioned it several times that this was, of course, built during the colonial period in the early part of the 20th century. I think for the Indians, the palace, I think they would like to think that it actually represents India at the zenith of its power in the 16th and 17th century before they were colonized by Great Britain. At any rate, let's get to some of the substance of the visit. Mr. Putin emphasized that trade is rising rapidly, hitting about 65 billion last year, and on target, maybe to likely to reach the goal of 100 billion that the two countries had set by 2030, possibly earlier. It is a very multifaceted economic and military security relationship. There was discussion of a fifth generation Su-57 fighter, the S-400 air defense system that the Russians have provided for India, their collaboration on the BrahMos missiles, India's premier ballistic missiles. Civilian nuclear cooperation is usually a feature of these foreign trips. Rosatom is currently building a large reactor in Kudan Kalam. Medical, pharmaceutical cooperation, and even Indian electric cars were mentioned, which maybe was a little slight towards China. I don't know. Considerable attention was given to the fact that the trade is done without the U.S. dollar. And there were two of Russia's top bankers, Andrei Kostin at VTB Bank and German Gref of Sberbank, Russia's largest bank, was also there. Also featured on the trip and the news was Margarita Simonyan there with Putin opening a new Russia Today office, RT office in Delhi. Maybe this was just a new office, but I would be kind of surprised if there were not an RT office already in Delhi. Nevertheless, Putin looked very pleased about this, but he commented acidly that in the West, they ban RT out of fear of the truth. I don't know that many people on this side of the pond view RT that way. Also featured on the Russian presentation was a very amusing cartoon video of Modi and Putin driving around in a motorcycle and sidecar with Modi singing in Hindu. Unfortunately, I couldn't understand it. Putin playing harmonica as they drove through oil fields, past S-400 air defense batteries, and then they drive through a gas station where Donald Trump is holding the gas pump, and they both diss Trump, and they continue on their joyride. It's kind of marvelous stuff, Chris. It was an Indian production, but it really served the purposes of Putin and Modi perfectly, I thought. It kind of reminded me of when Putin was in Pyongyang in June of 2024, riding in a car driven by Kim Jong-un, with both looking like 8-year-old boys at the amusement park. At any rate, I think the larger message is the multipolar world is alive and well. What's your take on this, Chris?
Well, it was certainly a fascinating report. First of all, it's a slap in the face of Trump as Trump's policy. So Trump was trying to get India to cut off buying oil from Russia, and this would supposedly force Putin to the table to pursue peace. And that's not working. Putin's showing this will not work with me. But what's the most fascinating for me as a Kremlin watcher is that there's no actual mention of Trump. They don't want to insult him, right? And clearly the minders, the FSB, have told the reporters, nothing should be overtly anti-Trump. We're seeing a new model for the post-war for Putin. This is a huge cult of personality where Putin, he's the top diplomat. That's the diplomacy is Putin. There's no sign of Sergei Lavrov or diplomats. Putin will decide everything. Also, we see the new business model. It's Putin again who's going to cut the deals, and we see Igor Sechin, his right-hand man, doing Rosneft, and then Sergei Chemysov, another confidant. And these aren't at all normal business people. They're connected with Russian intelligence. And we don't see any businesses, Wildberries or any kind of normal business, or even the former oligarchs. We don't see them at all. They're not mentioned. They're not part of the picture. It's going to be Putin who does the business deals. Of course, yeah, as you mentioned, Putin's putting propaganda first. That's hugely important for him, having propaganda and RT project his picture. We also see Putin again, just like when he was in Kyrgyzstan last week, this line that he respects traditions, traditional culture. And of course, this is again a slap to the Americans, the ugly Americans who don't value traditions. And we're seeing kind of neo-feudal economic ties. The big men, Modi and Trump are going to decide things. We're moving into the strange kind of non-monetary economy where, of course, the Russians, they sell this oil to India, but India doesn't really buy much from Russia. And so Russia's getting they can't get dollars, right, because of the sanctions. So they're getting Indian rupees, which they can't really use. And so, they have to cut some kind of weird, barter or something, supposedly, to get this trade to work. The bottom line, what they're saying here, the Kremlin is saying, this is a model for other countries, say South Korea. They should look at, the so-called sober policies of India and imitate Modi.
So, Chris, you mentioned that, and we've talked about this before, that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's been in his position now for 21 years, he has almost entirely disappeared from Russian media going back to late October. I remember seeing about, I don't know, around November 7th or 8th, one news broadcast where he was in it, but he is conspicuous in his absence. What's your take on this?
Last night we found out that Korea time, we found out Alexander Matsugura, this absolutely crucial figure for the war, the Russian ambassador to North Korea, died. We don't know even if it was in Moscow or Pyongyang, but the speculation is, of course, that there's some kind of purging going on. I know there's many Russian diplomats, they're panicking right now.
Yeah, it's odd. Lavrov is, I think, 75. He has smoked a lot of cigarettes and
Matsugura
drunk a
was
lot of
70.
scotch, lived
We just
lived
saw
a high
we
life.
just saw Matsugura healthy. He was just healthy a few days ago. So
Hmm.
there's some
Well, and
speculation.
another place Lavrov was not at, the second big story, of course, were the U.S. negotiations in Moscow earlier in the week before Putin took off for India with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner representing the Trump administration. One thing that was striking to me is that there was 5 hours of dialogue with Putin taking part in that entire 5 hours. But again, Lavrov was not there. Maybe it's less conspicuous this time because U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also wasn't there. But why don't you tell us more about these negotiations, Chris?
Well, it's another rich report. It's important, of course, in the West, they showed these meetings, but Russians got a very different picture. Right before this meeting, there was a war report where we saw the Russian reporters in the front lines, and they show a blown out German Leopard tank, the one that was supposed to be a game changer, change the war. It's blown up. And then we see, this is very important, they say, soon we'll have a victory parade. The victory parade, the West, has no options anymore. And then they move to the negotiations. So it's clear the Russian viewer in their head, they see, that this is a concession, that Trump has no cards. That's what they're saying.
Yeah,
So
it looks like when they said about Kupiansk and Nash, this week it was Volchansk and Krasnoarmeysk, that the Russian military is consistently making progress in Ukraine, and this is demonstrating the strength of the Russian position, and then they go to the negotiations.
yes. But it's very tricky. We have to point out, of course, that on the TV, you see these maps, they're blown up. So it looks like they're conquering huge territories. Where in reality, of course, they're not moving very far at all. It's an optical illusion. But yeah, so now turning to the negotiations, what we see is this dignified, mature diplomacy. And this contrasts, so this is supposed to contrast with the crazy, so-called crazy Europeans. So here, Trump has a vola k miru, that he has this will to peace. And then they show it's very straight. Trump is about the money, they say. So in Russia, the Godfather movies, Scorsese's Godfather is very popular. And that's what they're referring to. Nothing personal. It's business. They like this, and so we see Witkoff. There's no Lavrov. We see them at this table It's very important. Putin, when he meets with the Western leader, when he met before the Western leaders, there's this huge space, this huge, 10-foot space, where here they're sitting right next to one another. And then we hear Ushakov, the main negotiator, he says that the American proposals are acceptable. They're acceptable. We see there's light at the end of the tunnel, but they need to be worked out, right? They need to be worked out. And then they keep kind of repeating that Putin, he, держит слово, that he's a man. Putin is a man of his word, unlike the Ukrainians or Europeans, is what they're saying, right? And so yeah, it's the message is don't worry. They're telling the audience, don't worry. We have things worked out now. We have
One thing, excuse me, Chris, if I could jump in very briefly. One thing that struck me was that, well, of course, this was Jared Kushner's first participation in one of these U.S.-Russian negotiations. And they showed on Russian news a clip from CNN where the speaker is saying that he's expressing that he's happy that Jared Kushner is taking part in the discussions in Moscow because he's not as pro-Russian as Steve Witkoff. He hasn't drunk Putin's Kool-Aid. So the Russians showed this. So they're noting something about Kushner, and I think in a way they're showing respect toward Kushner the way they frame that. But as you're saying, Putin slovo держит. I mean, there's been no leakage actually of what was discussed at these talks in public. There's been all kinds of speculation in the press, but frankly, I mean, we don't know what's going on.
It's definitely a kind of Godfather vibe, where the Dons are meeting, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to contrast this, of course, with the so-called crazy Europeans. It segs this meeting segs immediately to that, and here the emphasize that Putin, he's in sync with Trump. They quote Elon Musk. There could be a European war, right? The Russian news is making a big thing of this. That the main point of the reports on Europe is to show, yeah, we need to prepare for war. They're preparing the population that, yeah, we could have a temporary peace in Ukraine, something with America, but we'd still have to follow Putin because, we have the Europeans to deal with. But they're also saying, don't worry so much. And they have this very strange report, this bizarre on the Italians. It's a bit racist.
Admiral Dragoni.
Yeah, that the Italians, they make good mafia bosses, but they're bad soldiers, and they have some very rude things. These Italians, they like to dress up in suits and хотят что-то поймать. They just want to go do some chick or something, right? It's very vulgar, very vulgar Russian.
Yeah, we won't say exactly how vulgar it is, but just trust us.
Yeah, it's kind of the F word. Oh, it is just like last week, these so-called historical discourses that Mussolini couldn't really fight, and so he had to have the Nazis bail him out. But for me, one of the most important aspects here was they emphasized the crazy Italian suits that the soldiers, the alpinisti, they like to dress up with feathers. And to me, this clearly this references another episode in Russia. They don't say it, but for Russians, it's got to be in their mind. This was during Medvedev's period. There's Yudashkin, he was a homosexual designer, and he dressed up the Russian troops. And the Russian nationalists, they were outraged. They're saying he's turning us gay. And so again, this is typical for the Russian news. They're rewriting the history. The bottom line is Russia, they have to prepare for a war with Europe. We can't, we can't let ourselves go. And so, Putin is going to be our leader. But again, guys, don't worry. These are Europeans who can't really fight. I think that was the message.
And what Dragoni said, and he is the top military advisor to the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, what he had said basically was that, that the Russians are very aggressive with their cyber warfare and that we have been reactive. and that maybe we should be more proactive. And the Russians took that and turned it into, Europe wants to attack us. And this was really another tough week for the Europeans in Russian news, and also, of course, with the publication of the new U.S. national security document. But 2 weeks ago, the Russians were referring to the European arsonists, the Европейские поджигатели, who were pouring gasoline on the fire. After the U.S.-Russian talks, Putin made some comments rather slyly to amp up the Europeans and their fears now of a Russian attack, which is there is a war hysteria kind of in Europe at the moment, by saying, I'm paraphrasing here a bit, if the Europeans want war, if they attack us, they will not get a calibrated response like we are conducting with the special military operation in Ukraine. But essentially, very quickly, there will be nobody to talk to there, i.e., it will be nuclear Armageddon. And then Kyiv goes into the cascade of European reports that took this comment of Putin's and were saying that Putin was threatening nuclear war, when in fact he was simply saying if Russia were attacked. There was always that conditionality. Now, my take on this is a little contrarian, in that it's true, of course, that a direct war between Russia and Europe, between Russia and NATO really does risk nuclear Armageddon in ways that the Ukraine war does not. And in my view, and this is just my opinion, this is why Putin would not take this risk. I mean, the risk of attacking a member of NATO it's just too risky. It's not worth it. But then, as you were saying, Chris, Kyiv goes on to refer to the Europeans as irrational idiots, idioti. No wonder Trump doesn't want them at the negotiating table. And their decisions to cut off economic ties, especially the gas trade, fundamentally run against their own interests. Fortunately, the Belgians are holding their ground in refusing various proposed schemes to allow us use of Russian central bank funds to cover Ukraine's massive budget deficits for the next 2 years. This is a big issue that's not been resolved by the European Union, and we know what the Russian position is on this. And then there were several references in the show to the U.S. National Security Strategy that was published this week, but they were all having to do with the very controversial remarks made about Europe, kind of accentuating the line that J.D. Vance had taken in his speech in Munich in early February, criticizing European democracy, criticizing European restrictions on freedom of speech, and taking other measures that were restricting democracy. Now, the Russians love that line. And so in the news show, Kyiv points out, and look at these guys, their popularity ratings, 10% for Starmer, 10% for Macron, 18% for Merz in Germany. They don't actually represent their people. And so there's a real coalescence there between the Russian and Trump administration portrayal of Europe at the moment. Well, let me turn to you, Chris, because it's another week of chaos in Ukraine, another story that the Russians are loving right now.
Yeah, so this is a consistent propaganda line, the chaos of Ukraine. They're of course they're trying to delegitimize the power. There's no one. That's what Putin says. There's no one to conduct negotiation with. It's just going to be Putin and Trump, no Zelensky. And they say in this one, Zelensky is a politichesky troop. He's a corpse. And of course, in Russia, when Putin says this is, it's not a metaphor. Yermak, he's this fat guy. He can't really fight. They kind of make light of him. And then, so this is a typical, FSB type dirty report that Zelensky's wife Yelena, she's sending the Ukrainian children into slavery, and then there's just absolutely outrageous.
Sexual slavery.
Yeah, outrageous, salacious claims. We see this all the time. This is to, of course, muddy the waters, and this is a classic. Goes back to the French Revolution, right? Of course, the princess that's causing all the queen is causing all the problems, right?
Marie
And then
Antoinette.
right after this report, we see just briefly our favorite Anna Tsevelova, Putin's niece. She's has a volunteer program, Мы вместе, right, where the youth, they all just have fun. They have fun and do some good work, right? Do some good work and help the poor. And so there's a contrast, right? What's going on in Ukraine, the chaos and the debauchery of Ukraine, and then the порядок, the order in Russia. And we've seen several times. We've seen Viktor Medvedchuk, Putin's. He's this kind of power broker, shadowy power broker in Ukraine. He was captured by the Ukrainian soldiers, and then Putin traded him for. Many Ukrainian soldiers go back to Ukraine to get this guy out, and now he's reappeared in Russia. And I think so. This is just me. I might be wrong, but just kind of reading between the lines, I think what they're doing is they're trying to set up Medvedchuk as the legitimate, legitimate leader, and he could. They could try to get him and for all of Ukraine or part of occupied Ukraine, or they're clearly setting him up as to bring him back as a political figure. And I'd say a lot of these leaks we've seen, the so-called Mindich Gate, the leaks of corruption, these might be coming from. I'm certain they're coming from Medvedchuk's people. There's got to be some kind of insider, and so that's what I see here.
Yeah, well, from Putin's standpoint, having Medvedchuk as the next leader of Ukraine would be the dream scenario, with
Yes.
Medvedchuk being kind of like a Marshal Pétain in France during the Second World War, a Nazi collaborator. There was one other another scandal that they made a big deal about, and this has to do with Federica Mogherini, another Italian, former foreign secretary, holding the foreign secretary position in the EU, 2014 to 2019. And since then, she has been at the College of Europe in Brussels, which is a training ground for European diplomats. And the story is that, she was detained and questioned for 10 hours in Brussels about a possible corruption scheme. Right now, they're simply allegations, but it gets back to the theme that the Russians are promoting. Putin made the comment last week, who is teaching whom? The Europeans are corrupt. The Ukrainians are corrupt. Again, a featured theme. So another story that we've talked about, Chris, in the past couple of weeks had to do with the attacks on the oil terminal in Novorossiysk, and then last week, the further attacks of Ukrainians on oil tankers of the Russian shadow fleet in waters, off of near Turkish waters.
Yeah, so this is part of Trump's strategy to bring Putin to the negotiating table, was to, cut off the sale of oil and then destroy the refineries and really hurt the economy. By most accounts, this has been working. There's huge lines for gas in Russia, but the Russians spin it differently. Of course, they show the missteps, and the way they spin it is that the pirates, they call them the pirates. They're just attacking civilian ships, innocents, and they make a big deal. They're not attacking our ships. They're attacking Kazakh ships, Turkish ships. These are the people who are suffering. And Putin, saying enough is enough of this, this craziness, these pirates. And he makes a very serious threat. He's saying we'll just need to then cut off Ukraine completely from the Black Sea. And they're hinting, they show on the map Odessa. that if you don't make peace, then our troops will move next to Odessa. That's what I saw in this.
Clearly, the attacks on the oil terminals and the attacks on the tankers are an escalation from the standpoint of Ukraine along the lines that you mentioned. And Putin is making it very clear that there are ways that Russia could respond with their own escalation that would be quite unfortunate for Ukraine. It was this was more of a pointed threat that rather than the nature of the one that I think he made toward Europe in general about nuclear Armageddon. At any rate, these were the top stories this past week.
Yes.
We like to close the show and talking about the dogs that didn't bark. And this week for me, I was kind of surprised there was not more reporting on Trump's national security strategy, which is basically a repudiation of a lot of aspects of U.S. foreign and security policy for the last 35 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Almost a man.
Andy, could you explain to the viewers what actually is this? How important is this national security strategy? For those of us outside Washington, I don't know if
Yes, for those of us
we really
outside
get it so much.
outside the Beltway, that's a good
Yeah,
question, Chris.
yeah. What is
Well,
it?
these are documents that are produced about every 4 years. Each new administration makes an assessment of security threats to the United States and the prioritization of U.S. perception of the threat, the scale of the threats, and also the kind of response to them. Now, how important are they? Well, we have to take them a bit with a grain of salt because when you're making policy, most of what you're making policy is reacting to unexpected events that turn into crises on in your inbox. It reminds me of the great line of the retired boxer Mike Tyson, very philosophically said, "Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face." So yes,
I like that.
every administration has an outlook and a priority list of threat perception as well as what they would like to accomplish. Now, what was interesting about this? There are a lot of interesting aspects to this, but this was a dramatic uh, repudiation of a lot of kind of the core themes of U.S. foreign and security policy for the last 35 years. It's beyond just, everything that Joe Biden did was stupid. It's that the United States needs to be effectively more restrained in its international behavior. It can't be the gendarme for the rest of the world. This notion that we're the indispensable power in the world that Madeleine Albright talked about in 1999, which I never liked myself because it kind of encouraged behavior that, where the means don't really match the ends. Why did we fight, two land wars in Eurasia, in Iraq and Afghanistan? Did we really need to fight land wars as part of the war on terror? And then the commitments, the treaty commitments that we have in Asia and Europe. Now, Trump is they're not directly repudiating those, but they're accentuating the point, which they've made repeatedly, that our allies and partners need to take much more responsibility for their own security. And also, and this is kind of an interesting note from the Russian perspective, there's a lot of emphasis on the Monroe Doctrine, and that what is most immediately threatening to the United States are some things that are happening in the Western Hemisphere, and that we need to pay more attention to that. And it's an allusion in a way, to the policy toward Venezuela right now. But it also represents a real ratcheting back of U.S. commitments around the world. It's kind of funny that if we go back to 1992, the Russians, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians loved the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. They wanted their own Monroevskaya Doktrina. in which essentially would give the Russians a free hand in those new states that were formerly republics of the Soviet Union. And of course, this has been a point of great controversy and conflict between the United States and the West with Russia for the last 35 years. So there are a lot of things, I guess, that the Russians should like about this national security strategy. We don't want to, overdo the importance of these kinds of documents, but Russia produces documents like this. The Chinese do. Most large countries do. Sometimes they call them white papers, but they were only really talking this week, at least, about what the document had to say about Europe. What's the dog that isn't barking for you, Chris?
Yeah, that's right. What you said, these Russian propagandists, not really journalists, they're not going to stick their head out. And it's probably the Kremlin hasn't really worked out their response yet to this.
True.
I would say that there could be some downsides for Russia if America completely retreats from Europe, like we're saying. They could end up with some kind of European war. So but be careful what you wish for. The thing, of course, it was very interesting, kind of tying in what you're saying is, again, there's no mention at all of Venezuela or Cuba. This is so the New York Times and Washington Post. There's reports that maybe the U.S. has committed war crimes. Seth. The Russia, it's already prepared. Here's your news. They can just repeat, the lines in the New York Times, but they don't go for that. So obviously, they've been told to stay away any criticism of Trump. This is why they don't want to derail peace talks. They don't want to derail these and the side deals, of course. Instead, we see Trump with Sylvester Stallone. And this is given good. This is like the central news story from the U.S. So of course we also there's as always there's no mention of economics. What's happening in the economy. By the way, if you're a Russian watcher, please stay at the local news. That's often the most informative, where we do see there's a lot of surrogate, fake products. Like in the 90s, people are getting poisoned because they have to buy these counterfeit products. We see less and less from the regions. They leave out a lot, and it makes you wonder what actually the state of the Russian economy is.
It's a great point. You're not going to learn anything watching Russian news about the state of the Russian economy right now. I think it's time for us to close for this week. This is just the third episode of this, and Chris and I are eager to get feedback from you. And you can contact me at Kuchins, Akuchins, at cftni.org. And you can contact Chris at chrismonday@gmail.com. Give us your feedback about how we can improve this. And we will look forward to seeing you again next week. On behalf of both of us, we want to thank Jordan Henry, who is our valiant producer at the Center for the National Interest in Washington. Bye-bye.
До свидания.